All right. Welcome to episode 3 of Track Records with your hosts, Kenny and Barry. And picture yourself that you've stumbled into a conversation between two music geeks at a party, and we're just chatting. And if it's interesting to you, you stay in the room and listen. If it's not, you move on and come back later when maybe it's a topic you find yourself more interested in. So, Barry, what were we talking about last time?
So we ended the last call. We were talking a little bit about the Grateful Dead, um, them being your all-time favorite band, or certainly one of them. My question to you was, did you see the Dead when they were still the Dead? And when I say that, I mean while Jerry was still kicking.
Yes. And so the first time I saw the Dead was, I think, 78 or 79 at Boston Garden, and then saw them throughout the years in mainly in Boston and New York. And never saw them again after Jerry passed. I was not interested in Dead and Company or any of the offshoot bands. It just not, I didn't think it was that interesting. Plus, also by the time Jerry passed, the Dead were playing mainly stadiums, and I'm just not interested in stadium shows. So I only saw I now of course they were too big to play anything smaller than arenas, but that's where I saw them, because once they're playing in a football stadium, no one's good in that situation.
I agree with you. Although certainly some concert experiences that we both had, if you wanted to see a particular band, you would have to go to one of those big stadiums or arenas or whatever. But I,
No, and I do make an exception. I did see the Rolling Stones at Wembley in England, and I thought, well, okay, that's a pretty cool exception. If you're going to see them in a stadium, that's the stadium to see them in. So,
slightly larger than a small club, I guess.
yes,
Uh,
just a bit.
so following up on your Dead experiences, so how many times did you see them
Uh,
altogether?
so I would say probably about 12 or 15 times.
That's a hell of a lot.
Well,
Um,
that's one of the
although,
differences between you and I, is that you've spent so much time in bands, you've been on the stage, and like, so yeah, probably haven't seen as many shows as I have, because I spent all my
mm,
time going to shows. Now I know you've gone to a lot of shows. Okay.
yeah, yeah, that would be an interesting thing to dig into at some point. Like if we could list every single show we've ever seen since we started going to shows, that might be kind of fun to
I
compare notes.
I wish I kept track. A lot of it is like lost in the ether of my memory banks. But I will say one of the big things was I already was going to shows on my own and going to shows with my brother and sister, and then with Julie, my first wife, and then when Kim and I got together, Kim and I were going to so many shows because she is such a music geek as well. And so when we first moved to Austin, we were going to literally seriously 3 shows a week. And then when South by Southwest, for the uninformed, music festival that happens every year in Austin, which brings it together tons of bands from all over the world, and we'd go to that. So we'd see numerous bands, over the course of a week every year. So
So I take it you weren't one of these goobers who saved all your ticket stubs like
no,
me.
no. As a matter of fact, the good friend of mine and Kim's, Rolly, he has notebooks with the ticket stubs and little notations and everything, and he saved everything. I wish I had in retrospect, but I could never be bothered.
Oh, that friend of yours sounds like such a geek.
Yeah.
I would never think of doing such a thing. Um, so okay, so again, back to your Dead shows. Were you?
And at my dead shows, I was definitely altered, and so
That's
there
what I
was,
was going to ask you.
yeah, and
Were
so I was
you
not saving
tripping
ticket
at most of
stubs.
them?
uh probably half of them, the earlier ones, particularly when I was in school or in college. When I was some of the later ones, I was actually working in on Wall Street as a broker, and so I could not like then go to work the next day after you finished an acid trip the day before. So
Well, from everything else I heard about that period of your life, I'm surprised you couldn't do that as well.
different drugs.
Yeah, yeah, too much of a mind fuck of a hangover
Yes,
the next day after doing acid.
yes, you need. There are other drugs that are much more suited to work. So
So that's funny because I didn't know if I don't think we've ever talked about acid experiences. didn't know if you had ever done that before. Was it
The
only around Dead shows?
No, definitely in high school, and then in particular, and also freshman year in college. But I remember the first time I saw the Dead when I was tripping, I looked up in the ceiling and saw this giant purple locomotive chugging across the ceiling as the Dead were doing Saint Stephen, as that stuck with me all these years, that memory. So,
Um,
and I was also
it's
lucky enough never to have a bad experience. So.
yeah, yeah, that makes one of us. So what was your favorite Dead show? If you had to pick one, gun to your head, you
Probably
have to
that
pick
one,
one.
that one because it was the first time I saw them. And there was something, it was, so unique. It was much different than any band I'd seen before. And by the time uh and also, although I knew them, I didn't know them backwards and forwards like the way I do now. And so later on, like, there are definitely bands who I like, or Kim and I like, and yet when they do a certain song, that's like bathroom break time, or like go get a drink time, or whatever. And so, and I wasn't going to do that at that first Dead show. I didn't want to miss a thing. So, as opposed to
That
like every time the old 97s go into the song Question, which is one of their most popular songs and a song people use for like their wedding, vows and everything all the time. As soon as they go into that, Kim and I bolt for the bar. So,
um, I had mentioned that I saw the Jerry Band once.
right.
I considered their whole set time to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, and that's
It was
definitely
so fucking
where
boring.
our tastes diverge.
And I will say, um, it like I mentioned, it was at Squaw Valley, so it's like a natural amphitheater because the stage was set up at the bottom of a ski run, and so we were a mile away, and that's why it was easy to fall asleep. I'd
And,
mentioned that
and
I
that
fell
definitely makes
asleep,
that
and
definitely makes a difference too. I mean, obviously, that's why, like, at clubs, even though I'm claustrophobic and so it's tough for me, I want to be as close to the stage as possible.
for sure. Um, and I wanted to circle back on something we were talking about
Yep.
the last episode, is the Dead and their relation to jazz. Um, I it's not that I don't think they were influenced by jazz and certain aspects of jazz, like the improvisation that comes with jazz, or the exploration. I totally agree that that is something that they are influenced by, at least from what I've read and the little bit that I know about the Dead. What I was getting at is I've never heard anything by them, any music that actually was straight jazz, meaning jazz with jazz timings, jazz drum patterns, jazz chords, like a real jazz band.
Right.
That's more what I was getting at.
And that's fair. It more jazz influenced than actual jazz
Yes,
itself is
yeah, like the
what
whole thing with them playing on the same bill as Miles Davis at the Fillmore East, in the early '70s. Um, so, I know they have um, talked about that and how that was such a big influence on
and,
them. But
and
I still, yeah, I'll believe it when I hear it with them
well,
actually playing jazz.
you have to listen to the live recordings only. And to tell you the truth, actually, most of their studio albums aren't that good. There's a couple like Working Man's Dead or American Beauty that are quite good, but for the most part, you can ignore their studio albums. It's their live albums, which is where it's at. And there's literally well over 100 live albums, believe it or not. And that's where you hear them doing, like, they don't start, here's the start of the song, here's the end of the song, the way pretty much every other artist or band does. They really
Yeah.
flow into a song and flow out of a song in a much more jazz-like approach.
Um, it's funny that you mentioned their studio albums not being your favorite. Another friend of mine, one of my golf buddies, is a massive, massive Dead fan. Like, that's all he listens to. That's all he literally, excuse me, all he listens to. And he doesn't listen to the studio records either. He just listens to live
That's
shows.
that's that every serious Dead fan is going to be just like that. That's how I am. I never listen to the studio stuff. I'm always interested in hearing different live versions, and in particular, that's what like Dead fans do. Like the May 1977 from Cornell University. Like that's a well-known show that everyone that's a great show, and that's how Dead fans talk about this show, this year, this location. It's never about this album or that album. It's really about the live stuff.
And I have probably 8 to 10 Dead records. A couple of them are live ones, like Steal Your Face.
Steal Your Face, yep.
I think I have live. Is it Live 72 or Europe 72?
Europe 72, which is a triple disc. Yeah.
And to your point about American Beauty and Working Man's Dead, I have those too, and those are the ones that if I'm to pick out any Dead records that I like, those would be the two. And I also like Blues for Allah. That's kind of a different.
And that's around the
record.
same time. And Terrapin Station's another good studio album, but mostly it's their live albums, and then not even their live albums so much as their bootlegs, because that's what a lot of their live records are taken from. And they're the only band that ever said, not only are we okay with taping, we're going to set up a section for our fans to tape our shows.
Yeah,
which is the exact opposite approach of every other artist. Springsteen certainly never did that.
Yeah. I always thought that was really cool that they did that, and hence the huge proliferation of Dead live shows and bootlegs and what have you, like those Dick's picks.
And that's what I was talking about. How there's also Dave's picks in between the two. There's close to 100. Show. Yeah, and if not every show, there are certainly selections from various shows or a whole show. But that's the cool thing. It's like it'd be cool if there's all that for Springsteen or for the Stones or for the Who or all that access to all that live material. It's great they did that.
There is a lot of, especially in this day and age, there's a lot of stuff out there for every band. I would be shocked if you could call out a band that you really like that you can't find a ton of illegal live stuff available to you either on YouTube or CDs or whatever.
Right, but it's not easily located or packaged. It's more detective work to find it.
All right, well, enough of this Dead nonsense.
Yes.
I wanted to touch on another topic.
Go.
If you don't mind.
Yep, please.
So, and this is something we've talked about a little bit offline. Are there any bands out of the bands that bands or artists that we worship that have never put out a stinker of a record? And that doesn't mean a band who's put out 3 records and they're all really good. That's a minimum of releasing 6 studio records.
Right. Not live, not greatest hits. Yeah.
Exactly. No compilations, nothing like that.
Yeah, no, I think the sad thing is so many bands that we like they do all these great albums, and the last album, in particular, it's usually the last album or the last 2 albums are just crap. Like the last Clash album, the last Talking Heads album, and it's just so sad. It's like break up before you release that album.
Yeah, and there's a lot of artists who have put out 15 really bad records since they were putting out good ones, and I think the main culprit in that arena would have to be the Stones.
Yes,
they're downright unlistenable and have been for, I would have to say, since maybe Tattoo You or the record after that. Was it Undercover?
Yep, and even that, I would,
yeah, and that's even under protest.
Yes.
So anyway, it's got to be a rare thing indeed for a band to go through their entire career without putting out just a complete shit record. And I'm wondering if you have any bands that you would say successfully did that.
So the ones
I definitely have some.
The ones I'd list off the top of my head of bands that you're familiar with, roxymusic. You stop me if you disagree.
No, I just want to hear what you have to say.
Thejam, huskerdu, the Replacements, and katebush, Emylouharris, And then I don't know how familiar with poidogpondering. They're another one I'd mention. And then another of my favorite bands, is Firewater. They're another one. Those are ones that come to mind off the top of my head.
All right, we'll take it easy.
Yep.
Okay, let's go. Can we go through each of those one by one?
Yep. So the Jam.
Okay, they made my list as well.
Okay.
And
And for me, I actually prefer their later albums.
yeah, that I would agree. Their last record, The Gift, fantastic.
Excellent.
They were
Yeah.
growing as a band,
Yep.
trying different things, different
Yeah.
types of songwriting.
So some bands,
really good.
by the time their last album, you're like, okay, you know what, just as well. And not the Jam. I was sad when they broke up because again, I thought they were getting better and better, much more interesting. I do like the early stuff. I do. It's just it's not nearly as interesting or diverse as their later stuff.
Especially those first couple records.
Yeah.
I find those to be the least interesting.
Yep.
I think they really hit their stride right around sound effects and The Gift, and then they broke up.
Yep, yeah, and it was just like because I got sound effects and I love sound effects. Then I got The Gift and I was like, wow, may even be better. And then they broke up, and it was sad. So
but also I gotta say I really have so much respect for Paul Weller to break up the Jam at their commercial peak, arguably their creative peak, and he said, "Fuck it, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore."
and I
So
understand
that's
that.
it.
And I also know he from everything I've read or heard, he's not the easiest guy to be in a band with. Um, but I did see him in concert. I saw the Jam, and then I also saw him solo. And both shows just great shows. He was actually even possibly better solo than he was with the Jam.
When did you see the Jam? Because they didn't come over to the States very often, certainly not to the West Coast.
Yep, I saw them. It was right, I guess, for sound effects. So what is that, 80, 81?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I think that came out in 81,
yeah.
maybe 80, but um okay, so who was next on your list?
Roxymusic.
Okay. Um Probably a top 5 or top 10 band all time for me up until um what was the record after the record after Siren was their 5th record.
Flesh and Blood.
Was it Flesh and Blood or Manifesto that came there was so the three of that original era of Roxy Music, and there was a pretty big gap between Siren and their next record. So
that was Manifesto.
Okay, Manifesto,
and, yep. and
Flesh and Blood, and then
Avalon.
Avalon. So I would have to agree with you, I guess. Those aren't my favorite of theirs. It's the earlier stuff that I love so much.
The early stuff is fantastic.
But they're not bad, right?
Yep. But For Your Pleasure, it is their first or second album, and it's fantastic. Second, and that's one I definitely recommend. Their first two, especially when Eno was in the band, their first two albums,
the first two,
is great. I highly recommend those albums to anyone. Avalon is obviously a much more accessible, album for music listeners, and I really do like Avalon a lot. But it's almost hard to believe it's the same band. One of the things that helped me appreciate Avalon was I'd also been listening to bryanferry solo albums throughout the years, and they're much more like that. And so,
however, the first handful, because he put out a lot, and he put out quite a few during the golden era of Roxy Music, and they sound like Roxy Music from that era until later, and then they started sounding more like Avalon and Flesh and Blood. But the first 3 or 4 could have been really good Roxy Music records, and there's a lot of Roxy played on them.
And they did, and then there were a lot of covers on those. So like his cover of Leslie Gore's "It's My Party" is just a fantastic cover, and that's on These Foolish Things, I believe is the name of that disc. And that's probably my favorite his solo discs, but I really liked almost all of his solo discs as well. And I saw Roxy Music in concert, and I saw bryanferry solo as well.
So when did you see Roxy Music?
So I saw Roxy Music I saw them twice. I saw them for Flesh and Blood, and I saw them for Avalon.
Okay, so a bit later.
Yeah, and then I saw bryanferry for Slave to Love.
Who was next on your list?
So next on my list would be huskerdu.
Okay, so another fave of mine. That was the first show I saw when I moved to San Francisco. It was huskerdu, excuse me, at the Fillmore West on the Warehouse tour. So
And
their last tour.
that's the one I
Um,
cannot believe I missed. Kills me to this
and
day.
and of course it was a great show. But I will counter with, are you very familiar with their first couple records?
Uh,
Metal Circus, Land Speed Record, Everything Falls
and
Apart.
I've heard of those. Everything falls apart more than the other two. I've heard them, and I just don't remember them as well. I really like started getting them more with like Flip Your Wig, and then
Yeah.
the albums after that.
So the reason I bring those up is because they are so raw and gnarly that they're almost unlistenable.
and that's the
So
funny thing about bands. Usually it's the last album of a band, whereas with them, or like even with the Beatles, like their first album is part of their weakest, and I think that's
their first few kind of
yeah,
suck.
and I think that's more unusual. But
It
it's interesting
wasn't
when it takes it long for a band to hit their stride.
well, and I would argue that they as they got better, they became poppier, like songs on Flip Your Wig
Oh yeah, yeah,
or Zen Arcade or
yep,
the records around then
yep.
is when they started getting listenable. And they laid the groundwork for those records with those first few, and they were I'd be curious to to
I'll go
see
back and listen to them.
what
Yeah,
you think of it.
yep.
They are really just super rough and raw and almost like it's almost like not even music at times. It's so fast and just really gnarly. It's
Yeah, no,
the only way I could put it. So
I will
I would
definitely go
have
back and
to
listen to those. Yeah.
I would have to put those records as not good records.
And that's fair. And because I really didn't think about those records when I was listening to Husker Du.
Okay.
And also Husker Du was once again one of those bands where, much like the Jam, by the time they hit Warehouse, I was like, okay, this is fantastic. This is phenomenal stuff. I cannot wait for their next few albums. And that was it.
Yeah.
Because they did one more album, which is the live album, The Living End, and
Yeah.
which is not even well recorded, but also again a live album which we're not going over. But I was really disappointed. And then Bob Mould founded Sugar, and I really liked them, but then still weren't as good as Husker Du by any means. And then they broke up, and then he went solo, and I like him solo as well, although not as much as Sugar, and definitely not as much as Husker Du. But and I've seen Sugar and I've seen Bob Mould solo, but never got a chance to see Husker Du. I actually did have a chance to see Husker Du, and I didn't go. And if there's any regrets in my life, that's one of them. I didn't know them at the time.
I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yes, it's very sad. Please shed a tear.
Who's next on your list?
Then who's next on my list? And then so I mentioned Poidogpondering. I don't know how well you know the band.
Just a second.
Yep.
You could not hear me clearing my throat there, right?
Right.
Okay. So my mic mute does work. I know them because I have one record. My friend Pat, from the singer from one of my bands, bought that record for me as a birthday gift, probably around 1990. So that's the only way I know them. I still have the record, and it's never been something that I've gone back to many times. I pull it out once in a while and it sounds okay. So it sounds like you really like them a lot.
And I really like them. Now, with them, actually, my favorite album of theirs happens to be a live album. And it's one of the last albums they did. I think it's maybe their last album. It's a double live album called Liquid White Light, which I really love. And one of the things about seeing them is, first of all, it's a collective, and so some of the band members would change, but it was usually eight people on stage. And Frank Oral is the lead singer and main writer, and he connects with the audience so well in a way that almost no artist I've ever seen. And so like he'll come on stage and he'll say like something like, welcome my friends. And you really feel like you're at someone's party as they then go and launch the music. And that's a connection. And so that elevates their music to me in a way that if I'd never seen them live, I probably wouldn't feel as strongly as I do about their other records.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So
for the record, the one that I have is their first record. Just the self-titled Poidogpondering. Do you know that one?
Yes, I do. And it's good. It's a little, up and down. Again, it took them a little while to hit their stride as well. They got better and better. You know, I guess there's some bands that are sort of like sitcoms, where like the first season is sort of like Seinfeld. The first season of Seinfeld, it sort of bumped its way and tried to figure out who was who and what role should be what. And it wasn't until their second or third season where the show became really, you know, the great show it became. And I think that's true for some bands too. Uh, I they I don't think they ever put out a bad album, but I don't, you know, I also wouldn't list their albums as, you know, they're not like the roxymusic albums. They're not, they put out this series of fantastic albums. And so there's a difference between putting out, like when I say a bad album, I mean it's an album I would never put on, you know, that I really dislike, like the Stones albums you were talking about before.
Like
Like,
Steel Wheels or
yeah,
some shit like that.
yeah, like I wouldn't play that, you know, or even Undercover of the Night I wouldn't play. Never mind their stuff after that. You know, like I would never, you know, and if someone was playing it, I would like walk out of the room. And so you know, it's like the last Clash album, Cut the Crap. It's not good. So
Um, who's next on your list?
and Kate Bush.
Yeah. Do you know her last couple records?
Yeah, and they're definitely the weakest albums she put out. By far, her earlier stuff, her first few albums, Lionheart, Never Forever, The Kick Inside, Hounds of Love, that is a tremendous run of albums in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really good. I think the later albums are okay. I don't think they're anything special by any means, but I don't think they're bad either. One of them is 50 Words for Snow, which is from
Mm-hmm.
the novel Smell a Sense of Snow. But the first, you know, few albums, especially The Kick Inside, that is as good of a solo record as I've heard from any artist.
Uh, Relatively recent record of hers. She's relatively recent. It's probably 10 years old at this point. It's a double called Ariel. Have you heard that record?
Yeah, I think that's
I
about 10
really
years
like
old.
that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
really like that a lot.
And again, like I said, I like it. I just don't like it as much as those first few albums. You know, with, you know, songs like Babushka, James and the Cold Gun, The Kick Inside. I really was a big Kate Bush fan, but she never came to the United States. She had a fear of flying and never toured here. So I would have seen her in a second.
Um, who's next on your list?
And then Emylouharris. Now, I got to say, admittedly, Emmylou's released a bunch of albums, and I'm sure there's an album here or there which I've not heard, but I've never listened to an album of hers and not liked it. So I'd find it hard to believe that there would be an actual bad album. But I gun to my head, I can't say I've listened to every single one of her albums. But I've
Mm-hmm.
certainly listened to many, and including also Trio, the ones she did with Linda Ronstadt and Dolly Parton. I saw them on that tour for the first Trio album. That was really fantastic.
Hmm.
Big Emmylou fan. My sister turned me on to Emylouharris way back in the day, and I really like her a lot. So
Okay, I don't have much to say there. I have a handful of her records, her early ones from the mid 70s, early 70s, and they're all really good country records.
yeah, like
But
Elite Hotel.
that's as far as I go.
Yeah, and so again, I really like her, and I don't know how much this matters, but she just seems like an awesome person. Every time I see her interviewed, you know, and like she just seems like totally cool, totally down to earth, you know. And I've
Mm-hmm.
seen her interviewed about Graham Parsons and all in their relationship, you know. And
Do you know that record? It came out, I think, in '89, called Wrecking Ball. That was
yep, yep,
produced by Daniel
yeah,
Lanois.
which was a different sort of album for her.
Mm-hmm.
I,
Really
I
good
really,
though.
it's excellent, and what was great was she took a chance with that record because it's very different from her other albums. But I really do like that quite a bit. I would recommend that album as well. That wouldn't be the first record I'd recommend getting of hers because it is different than her other stuff. I'd recommend one of her earlier albums like Elite Hotel, but I would definitely recommend that too.
It has his trademarks, his his production trademark stamped all over it.
Yes, absolutely. And as soon as you put the needle down, it's totally different than the album before or after. And that's what I also
Um,
found interesting about Trio. Very different sort of music.
who's next on your list?
And that's pretty much it. There were a couple of other people, but they weren't as relevant. Like I said, I mentioned Firewater. You wouldn't be familiar with all their albums.
No,
And so,
just one, in fact.
yeah. So let's move on. Let's go to your list.
Okay. Drum roll, please.
Yes.
So
You're the drum
before
roll
I
guy.
before I go into my spiel, I think at least it helps bands to meet the criteria if they break up relatively early. So if a band's together for 40 years, it's going to be really tough for them to
Yeah, in that way, I don't
only
blame the
put out good
Stones.
records.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The more albums you
However,
put out, the more risk of failure.
there are a couple on my list who have been around for close to that long, who I think have never put out a bad record.
Okay,
And
I'm
Midnight
intrigued.
Oil is the one I'm thinking of in particular. Their first record came out, I believe, in '79. Um, and they put out records consistently to 2022 with a 10 to 15 year break in the 2000s. And I will go to my grave saying none of their records would be considered total duds. There's some that are better than others, but by and large, every record they ever put out had something really great about it.
So actually, let me say, as far as bands with that sort of output over that length of time, I would also throw in, and once again, don't know all of their albums, but Yola Tango would be another one I'd mention in a similar vein, where they're up and down, but like when they're good, they're really good.
But have they
Um,
been around since the late 70s?
yeah, yep, it's hard to
Really?
believe. Yep,
That
and
long, huh?
yeah, and when they played every year, they played the Beacon Theater like 2 weeks in a row, the Beacon Theater in New York, and they sell it every show.
Mm-hmm.
And when Kim and I saw them at Tipitina's in New Orleans, it was packed. And for a band that like most people haven't heard of, it's just sort of strange, that sort of fervid response. But Midnight Oil. So unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with them as I should be. I've never listened to anything I didn't like. But the only song that ever got serious airplay was "Beds Are Burning." And so I know that, and I know that album. I know some of their other stuff, but I'm definitely not that well versed with the band.
So I know all their albums very well, have
So
them all.
what would
And
you recommend?
um, I would have to say my favorite one, it's called, the short title is 1098, but it's 1098 all the way to one, counting backwards. That's the title of the record.
I can fill in the
But
blanks.
um, yeah, you could kind of figure it out.
Yeah,
Uh, but Midnight Oil heads refer to it as 1098. I think that's their, let's see, fifth record, I think, fourth or fifth. I think that's my favorite. I don't know if that would be the place to start though. If you were uninitiated, um, I think maybe for the uninitiated, um, Diesel and Dust, which is the one that had
that's
Beds Are
with
Burning,
yeah, yeah.
and The Dead Heart was another song that was a hit in this country. And by the way, they've always had huge hits in
Australia.
their native Australia, um, throughout their whole career.
Yeah.
But yeah, they certainly only had a few here. And the record after that is called Blue Sky Mining, and that was a hit as well. A
Yeah.
minor hit, but a
Yeah.
hit nonetheless. So those would be places I would suggest people starting. But you could pick up any one of their records and listen to it and think, wow, this is a really good rock record, in my opinion,
I
of
like Peter
course.
Garrett's voice very much. I did like them. So
Um, my friend Dov and I have a history of seeing them together, and we drove up to Vancouver in I guess is either 2021 or 22. I guess it was 2021. But anyway, it's in the middle of the pandemic, and it was a big hassle to get over the border to Vancouver. But they played an outdoor show in this smallish park right in the middle of Vancouver, BC, and it was 45 years on, they were still very vibrant, and just still really a great live
no, that's
band.
impressive. Yeah.
Um, and another one I would put on that list, and even more so, just a sec, got to clear my voice again. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
Um, and you're probably going to argue with this, and this band goes back to, I think, '64. So that would be The Who.
Yes, I'll
Eh,
definitely argue with that. Uh,
Okay, so before you come back at that, I would argue that they're lesser records, like Face Dances, like It's Hard, like the one that came out about 3, 4 years ago called Ooh, and the one before that, The Endless Wire. While they're not great records by their earlier standards, they're still really good records in my opinion. So that's why I would look at the Who, and there's no absolute stinker in their entire catalog in my opinion.
I don't like Face Dances, and I think It's Hard is terrible.
Mhm.
Even like Who Are You? It's not a bad album, but it's certainly not a great album. And so I was pretty much done at that point. And you know what a huge Who head I am, and so love the earlier stuff. Quadrophenia is one of my favorite albums by far. It's an awesome album, and I love their earlier stuff, and even their mid stuff. Even Who by Numbers. I mean, that's all right. It's not a great album, but it's fine. I like it. But by the time they were doing Eminence Front, I was so done with them. And even and I like, I liked Pete's first couple solo albums, but even like Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes, I didn't even like that. I was done with him, done with them. And now whenever I see Pete and Roger like on stage somewhere, they look like your 90-year-old aunt. Like, wait, oh wait, those are rock and rollers. Okay, I thought that was like my aunt Hillary. Like, I just stop.
it is, it is weird how old men morph into old women and old
Yeah, and
women
they've
morph into old men
they've
eventually.
totally done it.
Um,
And when I saw them at Shea Stadium, and once again, I don't like stadium shows. I went because the Clash were opening, and I saw them, and I was like, I was already, and that was Kenny Jones, of course, on drums, and I was just
mhm.
done. So,
Yeah, I knew you weren't going to agree with that. But
and because I also hold them to a higher standard because they were
yeah,
so great.
I still think for me, they reach the criteria because I do think those records have some value. They're, I think they're still decent rock records, I gotta say.
Yeah,
Um, but anyway,
some
so
value when you sell them at the record store.
um, another one on the list, and this has more to do with the length of their career, I think, more than anything, because I can only imagine they would have started putting out shit. But Led Zeppelin, I don't think they put out a bad record at all.
Okay, so this gets tricky for me because now I'm going to try to separate my taste. With the Who, I'm willing to go to the mat to argue. Okay, with Zeppelin, it's more my taste. Like I really love the first Zeppelin album. I really like the second one. Really like the third one. I like the fourth one. I'm done with it. I'm done with Zoso, but I do like it. But I'm not a big fan of Physical Graffiti. I'm not a fan of House of the Holy. And then I thought Presence was terrible. But there's difference between my not liking it versus it being a bad record. So I would say that's a case of just my not liking it versus it being a bad record. Oh, and then they did Coda. And
Well,
so
that was just a collection of
that was a
outtakes
collection.
and
Okay. Yeah.
B-sides and shit
Okay.
like that.
Yeah.
But and even if it wasn't, I still think that's a solid record
See,
that has
like
some really
B-sides, I
cool
love the
stuff on
earlier
it.
stuff. My favorite stuff is like Traveling Riverside Blues and Hey Hey, What Can I Do? I
Mhm.
love that stuff. Really, like that to me is so much more interesting than like Bronyer or Stomp, which just like I change the station when that comes on. So
I, Zeppelin could just do no wrong in my book. Um, Anything they released, I find has some value.
did that
Uh,
carry on
e-
to the firm?
no, no, I never really liked the Firm.
They were terrible.
Uh, let's see. We have about less than a minute.
Yeah.
Um, the next band on my list, and I figured I'd get some pushback from you on Zeppelin.
Yeah. But
But
again,
there
like I said, that was
no
more
real
personal
stinkers.
taste. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and I get that. No real
Yeah.
like just absolute disasters like some of those later Dylan records,
Yeah.
which you just cannot defend them. They're
And,
so bad. Or
and
some of those
Aerosmith
Stones
certainly,
records. Oh yes,
you know.
another perfect example of some records that are just so awful. Like everything Aerosmith put out after they got back together falls into that
Yeah,
category.
terrible. Yep.
Um, so the next band on my list would be the Jam, which you had as well. And this is another one, again, not together for the longest period of time, but Funkadelic.